I slipped the letter into my coat pocket before anyone could see my hands shaking. My aunt was sitting at the head of the dining room table, the way she always did at family gatherings, like she was holding court. She had this look on her face. Satisfied, almost lazy. The kind of look you only get when you've already won something and you know it. My cousin was next to her. He caught my eye across the table and looked away first. That was when I knew. Uncle Roy had been sick for 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3 when they found it, stage 4 by the time the leaves turned last October. He never complained. That was the thing about him. He would come in from checking on his hardware store with grease on his hands and a pulled muscle in his back and ask you how your day was going. He meant it too. He had no children. His wife, my Aunt Lorraine, had passed 8 years ago from a stroke, so for the last year of his life, I was the one driving him to Vanderbilt for his infusion appointments. I was the one picking up his prescriptions from the CVS on Charlotte Avenue. I was the one sitting with him through the bad nights when the medication made him sick and the TV was too loud and all he wanted was someone to just be there. I didn't do it for the money. I want to be clear about that, because what happened later made everyone assume otherwise. I did it because he was the only person in my family who had ever treated me like I mattered. My mother had remarried when I was 9. Her husband. I'll call him what I called him in my head, which was nothing. Because I never found a word that fit, had 2 kids from his first marriage, a son, Weston, who was 11 then, and a daughter, Brooke, who was 7. We all moved into a house in Brentwood and my mother spent the next decade slowly reorganizing her world until I was a peripheral detail in it. Uncle Roy was her brother. He saw what was happening, even when my mother pretended there was nothing to see. He was the one who showed up at my high school graduation when my mother forgot to put it on the calendar. He was the one who co-signed my first apartment when I was 22 and my credit was thin from student loans. He sat across from me at the loan officer's desk in a button-down shirt he'd ironed himself and signed his name without hesitating. "You'll figure it out," he told me in the parking lot afterward. "You always do." I was 29 when he got his diagnosis. By then I had a decent job in healthcare administration at a hospital system downtown, a 1-bedroom apartment I was proud of, and a life I'd built without much help from anyone. But I rearranged all of it to be there for him. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 weeks before he died. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, Claudette, started showing up at his house in Green Hills more regularly. She and Uncle Roy had never been particularly close. She lived in Franklin, about 20 minutes south, and had her own life, her own money, her own husband who traveled for work. She would come by with casseroles and sit in Roy's kitchen making conversation while I finished up whatever needed to be done. I didn't think much of it at first. People come around when someone is dying. Sometimes guilt brings them. Sometimes genuine love. I gave Claudette the benefit of the doubt because she was family, and because I was too tired to think badly of anyone. Her son Weston, my stepbrother, the one who had grown up in the same house as me without us ever becoming anything resembling close, started coming with her about 3 weeks in. He would sit in the living room with his phone and make small talk with Roy about the Titans in the store, and Roy would light up a little the way he did when anyone paid him attention. I told myself it was fine. It wasn't fine. Uncle Roy passed on a Tuesday morning in early March. I had been there the night before, and had gone home around midnight when the overnight nurse arrived. My phone rang at 6:47 a.m. I already knew before I answered. The funeral was small. Roy didn't want a fuss. We buried him at Woodlawn on a cold, flat gray day with about 30 people, most of them from his church or the store. My mother cried in a way that seemed more performative than felt. Claudette stood very still with her sunglasses on even though there was no sun. Weston gave a short eulogy that surprised me because it was actually tender. He talked about Roy teaching him to change a tire when he was 16. I had forgotten Roy had done that. He had done that for a lot of people. I cried quietly in the back row and didn't say anything to anyone. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at the office of a probate attorney named Mr. Hargrove on West End Avenue. I had not been told what to expect. Roy had never discussed the specifics of his estate with me, and I had never asked. The hardware store had been in the family for 31 years. He owned his home outright. He had investments. He was not a wealthy man by any dramatic standard, but he had been careful and consistent his entire life, and careful, consistent people tend to leave something behind. I drove myself to the attorney's office. I sat in the parking garage for a few minutes and looked at my hands on the steering wheel. I was not prepared for what happened inside. Mr. Hargrove was a precise, unhurried man in his late 60s who read everything at the same measured pace regardless of what the words said. That was the thing that made it so disorienting. There was no change in his voice, no pause, no signal that anything unusual was occurring. He read the document straight through. My mother received Roy's china collection and a sentimental sum of $5,000 described as a token of shared childhood. There were small bequests to 2 longtime employees at the store and a donation to his church. The house, the investment accounts, the hardware store, and the remainder of the estate totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000 were left in equal shares to Claudette and Weston. I received nothing. There was not even a mention of my name. I sat very still. I kept my face composed the way you learn to when you've spent most of your life deciding that no one is going to see you fall apart. Claudette made a small sound beside me that could have been surprise but wasn't. Weston studied a spot on the carpet near Mr. Hargrove's desk. My mother looked at her hands. Mr. Hargrove finished reading, set the document down, and asked if there were any questions. No one looked at me. I stood up, thanked him in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, and walked out. I made it to the parking garage. I made it to the 3rd level where my car was. I sat down in the driver's seat and I did not move for a long time. Roy and I had talked, in that careful way people talk when someone is dying, about his wishes. Not specifics. He had told me the store should stay in the family. He had told me he wanted someone who understood its value to take care of it, not to sell it immediately, not to gut it. He had told me, more than once, that he wanted to make sure I was okay. I had not taken those conversations to mean anything specific, but sitting there in the dim concrete quiet of the parking garage, I understood with a slow, settling certainty that something had gone wrong. Not accidentally. Not the way paperwork goes wrong or memory fails. The wrong way. The kind that requires intention. I did not call anyone that day. I went home, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen table until it was dark outside. Then I started to think clearly. I thought about the timeline. Claudette's sudden appearances in the last months. Weston's visits. The casseroles. The small, deliberate kindnesses to a dying man who was lonely and who trusted people because he was the kind of person who had earned the right to trust. I thought about something Roy had said to me in January, about 6 weeks before he died. We had been watching Jeopardy. He loved Jeopardy, and during the commercial he had turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "I've been thinking about getting some paperwork updated. Lorraine's been gone a while now. Things should reflect where we are." I had not followed up. I had assumed it was something he was already handling with his attorney. I thought about that now with a different kind of attention. The following Monday I went to see a lawyer. Her name was Adeline Carter. I had found her through a colleague at the hospital who had used her for an estate dispute a few years prior. She had an office in Germantown and no framed diplomas visible on the walls, which I took as a good sign because it suggested she was more interested in work than in impressing people. I laid out everything I knew on her desk. The timeline, Roy's comments, the pattern of Claudette and Weston's involvement in his final months, the fact that the will I had heard read bore a revision date of 8 months prior, which meant it had been changed while Roy was undergoing treatment, when he was on medication, when he was not always himself. Adeline listened without interrupting. She took notes on a legal pad in small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she said, "Do you know who his attorney was before Hargrove?" I did. His name was Patterson. He had an office in Bellevue. Roy had mentioned him occasionally over the years. "That's useful," Adeline said. She set down her pen. "I'm not going to promise you anything because I don't make promises about outcomes. But I'm going to tell you that what you've described has several characteristics of undue influence. And undue influence is contestable." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. She told me. What followed was not dramatic in the way that courtroom things look on television. It was exhausting. It was slow. It was a series of document requests and depositions and phone calls and waiting, always waiting, in the particular suspended way that legal proceedings make you wait. Not knowing what's coming, not being able to plan around it, just existing in the uncertainty of it. Adeline subpoenaed Roy's medical records from the period during which the will had been revised. She obtained records from the pharmacy showing the medications he had been on, several of which, she noted, can significantly affect cognitive clarity and susceptibility to suggestion. She contacted Patterson, Roy's original attorney, whose office had retained notes from a meeting with Roy approximately 10 months before his death. The notes described Roy's intentions at that time. His estate was to be divided with the store going into a managed trust, the house to be sold with proceeds distributed, and a meaningful bequest, specifically named to me. That document did not match what had been executed 8 months later. Claudette retained a lawyer of her own. His name was Birch, and he was aggressive in the way that lawyers who represent people who know they've done something wrong are aggressive. Loud, preemptive, fond of language designed to make you feel like you were the one behaving badly. He sent a letter to Adeline suggesting that I was a disgruntled relative attempting to exploit a grieving family for personal gain. He suggested that my proximity to Roy in his final months was itself suspicious, that perhaps I had been the one exerting influence. I read that letter sitting at Adeline's conference table and felt a rage so pure and cold it was almost clarifying. Adeline set it aside without changing her expression. "Let them talk," she said. "We have the pharmacy records, the original attorney's notes, and 3 witnesses from his church who will testify to conversations they had with Roy in the months before the revision. They have a document with a timestamp that doesn't match anything else in his file. Let them talk." The deposition of Weston was the moment things shifted. I was not in the room. Depositions aren't like that. But Adeline told me afterward, in the particular calm way she told me things when they mattered, that he had been inconsistent. He had described conversations with Roy that didn't align with dates he'd provided to the estate. He had claimed Roy had been lucid and uninfluenced during the revision period, and then described symptoms and limitations that directly contradicted that claim. He was not a practiced liar. That was the thing. Claudette was. She had a smooth, rehearsed quality to her answers that was harder to crack. But Weston was 31 years old and had grown up in a house where the adults did things they didn't explain to the children, and he had never quite learned how to look comfortable when he was lying. The crack in his deposition was small but real. Adeline knew what to do with small but real. Adeline knew what to do with small but real. It took 11 months. 11 months of my life suspended in that particular waiting. I kept working. I drove past Roy's hardware store on Gallatin Pike sometimes, the one that still had his name on the sign, and I would make myself keep driving because stopping felt like something I couldn't afford to do yet. I thought about him a lot. Not with bitterness, which surprised me, with something more like grief and gratitude mixed together, for what he had been, for what he had meant to try to do, for the fact that someone had seen me and wanted to take care of me even from a distance, even after he was gone. That mattered. Even with all of it, that mattered. The mediation happened on a Thursday in February. All parties were present. Adeline had laid the groundwork so thoroughly that by the time we sat down in that conference room, the other side was negotiating, not fighting. Birch had lost the aggressive posture. Claudette sat with her hands folded on the table and did not look at me. The settlement that was reached restored a substantial portion of what Roy's original notes indicated had been his intent. I was not going to get everything. That's rarely how mediation works, but I received a meaningful share of the estate, including a partial interest in the hardware store. I did not cry in that conference room. I had used up my crying in parking garages and kitchen tables late at night. I thanked Adeline in the elevator going down. She said, "You did the work. I just knew where to put it. There's one more thing I want to tell you, because I think it matters." 2 weeks after the mediation concluded, I went back to Patterson's office, Roy's original attorney. I had met with him once during the proceedings, but briefly, functionally. This time, I just wanted to ask him something. I asked him what Roy had been like at that meeting 10 months before he died, when he had laid out his original intentions. Patterson thought about it for a moment. "He was very clear," he said. "He had thought it through. He knew exactly who he wanted to take care of and why." He paused. "He talked about you for a long time. He said you never asked him for anything. He said that was exactly why. I drove home on I-65 with the windows cracked even though it was 40 degrees, because I needed the cold air on my face. Roy had seen me the whole time. That's what none of the rest of them understood, and that's what they couldn't take from me no matter what they signed or revised or maneuvered. He had seen me. He had wanted to take care of me. And in the end, through 11 months of depositions and pharmacy records and a lawyer who didn't make promises about outcomes, he did. I think about what I would tell someone in the same position now. Someone sitting in a parking garage, not moving, not knowing what to do next. I would tell them, get quiet. Get a good lawyer, keep your receipts, and don't let anyone make you feel like fighting for what's right is the same thing as being wrong. Roy taught me most of what I know about being a person worth trusting. It turns out he also taught me something about not letting people take what isn't theirs. I'm still learning to be as steady as he was. I'm working on it. I used to think that doing the right thing quietly was enough. That showing up without being asked, without expecting anything in return, was its own kind of answer to the world. Uncle Roy believed that too. He lived that way for 60-something years, steady, generous, unassuming. And I think I absorbed it from him the way you absorb things from people you admire without realizing it's happening. But here's what I had to learn the hard way. Quiet decency doesn't protect itself. It needs someone willing to stand up for it when other people decide to take advantage of it. Claudette and Weston made a calculation. They looked at a dying man who trusted the people around him, and they decided that trust was an opening. They moved carefully, slowly, the way people do when they know what they're doing is wrong but believe they're clever enough to make it look otherwise. They brought casseroles. They made small talk about football. They waited. And for a while it worked. The document existed. The signatures were real. The estate had been redirected. What they miscalculated was this. The truth of what Roy intended didn't disappear just because a piece of paper said something different. It existed in Patterson's notes. It existed in pharmacy records. It existed in the memory of people from his church who had sat with him and listened to him talk about his wishes. The truth had a paper trail, because Roy had been a careful, consistent man his entire life, and careful, consistent people leave traces. Every action has a consequence that follows it with the same weight and shape as the action itself. Claudette and Weston chose to exploit someone vulnerable. That choice produced a paper trail that contradicted their version of events. That contradiction became the foundation of 11 months of legal proceedings. And those proceedings produced an outcome they had not planned for. That's not luck. That's not fate in any mystical sense. That's simply the way that dishonest actions tend to unravel when someone patient and methodical decides to follow the thread. Adeline was that kind of person. So, I'd like to think, was I, by the end of it, what I carry with me now isn't bitterness toward Claudette or Weston, though I won't pretend those feelings were never there. What I carry is something more useful, the understanding that integrity is not passive. It has to be defended sometimes. It has to be willing to sit across a conference table and say, clearly and without flinching, this is what was right and this is what was taken and I am here to correct that. Roy spent his life taking care of people who needed it. He co-signed my apartment. He showed up to my graduation. He drove himself to a hardware store on Gallatin Pike for 31 years and treated every customer like they mattered. The least I could do was fight for what he meant to leave behind. I'm still learning to be as steady as he was, but I think he would recognize the effort. And honestly, that's enough for me.